Matthew 8:1. This is right after the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But when you get to chapter 8, verse 1, we're still in the initial aftermath of the lesson. And this is what happened right after the Sermon on the Mount. It says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Jesus had just finished saying some pretty unusual things. Here's just a handful, just to kind of refresh your memory. These are some of the things that these people had just heard. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. The way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. These are just a few of the things that Jesus had just got done presenting to everyone. He had just said these things. The people who were following him after this, maybe they were curious at this point. He'd said a great deal. After saying all these things, what would Jesus do next? Maybe that's what their purpose is, to follow him. What would happen next after he had said all these things? It's one thing to say a bunch of words, but what are his actions going to be? And what did come next might be the last thing that you'd expect, especially since Jesus was currently surrounded by a crowd of people. A man approached him, and of all people, it was a leper. This is right after the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, and then this leper approaches Jesus. And in case you didn't know, a leper was an outcast or a pariah. The law was very specific. The passage that was read for us just a short while ago, it's Leviticus 13. Keeping in mind what we're talking about, this man that's approaching him, here's what the life of a leper would be under the law. Leviticus 13, verse 45, as for the leper who has this infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean, to give everybody a heads up that he was coming. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. That could be a lifetime if the infection remain. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. It was all about exclusion, and it might seem harsh, but it's quarantine. It was all about containing the disease. A leper could be contagious, and he had no business being around other people. But this leper was headed right for Jesus, who was currently surrounded by a crowd. When you keep all this in mind, this is an interesting situation. But this leper knew something about Jesus. If you go to Matthew 8:2, we're going to look at Matthew 8 a little bit more. So this leper, right after the Sermon on the Mount, comes up to Jesus. This is Matthew 8, verse 2. And a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. So apparently at some point earlier, this leper apparently talked himself into approaching Jesus. You know, after all, in his position, he didn't really have anything to lose. If you take a second to imagine the life of this man, his life long before this point, maybe before he had leprosy, because he once was not a leper. There was a time when this leper had plans, probably had a career of some sort, maybe even big dreams and aspirations to be something when he was younger. When the sun rose up every morning, there were possibilities, the excitement that things can get better. But this was not the case anymore. Leprosy took everything away from him. His life was reduced to just survival. All the good stuff went away, and he couldn't stop it from happening. He was a man who had no control over his situation. So, if you think about it, if you're in his shoes, what do? When you're in complete darkness, what you do is you reach for the faintest glimmer of light. You ignore the crowd, and you walk up to this teacher. It seems likely, I can only imagine, this leper had heard rumors about Jesus being able to heal. You can tell it by, what he's saying here. So if you're in his shoes, you find Jesus, you walk up to him and you say, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. The leper had no control over his life, not much he could do to change his situation, but one thing he could do is he could walk up to Jesus. And you can imagine the reaction of the crowd. It's not recorded. I imagine some of them were offended, maybe afraid. Lepers were supposed to keep their distance. And it's not unlikely that some of them were ready to chase him off. At the very least, there might have been an awkward silence, but notice the leper's choice of words. And maybe that's what made everybody pause if they did, because there's no record of them chasing him off. The leper didn't say this. He didn't ask, can you take away my leprosy? Notice that's not what he said. In fact, you'll notice he didn't even ask anything. There's no question here. There's no question mark in this text. The question is implied, but it was more of a statement than anything. He said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Period. The leper's words indicated faith. I know you can make me clean. He wasn't there to debate whether or not Jesus could cure him. The leper simply assumed Jesus could. And at this point, Jesus does two shocking things. It's in Matthew 8, verse 3. And there's a detail that's easy to miss here. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Two shocking things happened. And the first thing is he touched the leper. He touched the leper. Now, there have been many times, in fact, we're about to see, he is more than capable of healing without touching. He's more than capable of healing without even seeing the person he's healing. But he touched the leper, and then he made the leper not a leper. You don't touch lepers. Everybody knew that. This man probably couldn't recall the last time he'd had any physical contact of any kind with another human being. A handshake, a friendly pat on the back, just a tap on the shoulder. Those are just some of the things that went away when he became a pariah, the ultimate untouchable. But now, Jesus touched this man and made him touchable. No more leper. Even though it might not have been easy for this man to approach Jesus, the logic was simple. You imagine the things going through his mind. When you have nothing, it just makes sense to go to the one person that seems to have everything. We kind of tend to think that way too when it's our turn to suffer. When we go through tough times, whether it's just a solitary rough day or a situation that lasts a very long time, we can identify with this ex-leper. When we feel like we have nothing to lose, we pray. When we feel like we're out of options, we might read our Bible. When we're pushed to the edge, that's usually when we seek out these things. And we finally see how logical it is to turn to Jesus. So keep this leper in mind. But not long after the leper, Jesus was approached by another man. Someone drastically different than the leper. And this man was a centurion. He was not a feeble victim of disease. He was a strong soldier, a healthy, strong soldier. He was a man in control. Nobody would have flinched at his approach, at least not for the same reasons. And not only is he in control of his life, unlike the leper, he's in control of several lives, 100 to be exact. A centurion, by definition, was in charge of 100 men, 100 soldiers. Whereas the leper had very little to say, if in anything, including his own body. Here was a centurion with power and influence. With one command or gesture, 100 able-bodied, non-leprous men would snap to, and if necessary, snap bones, whatever they needed to be done. This man who approached Jesus was, for the most part, absolutely in control. By definition, he was in control. But on this particular day, not so much. Matthew 8, verse 5. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. This man was a centurion with compassion. That says a lot about this man. He had a servant who was very sick. And he goes to the trouble of tracking down Jesus for the sake of his servant. Although this centurion could make 100 men take action, he couldn't make this one servant well again. And at first, when you look at these two men, you begin to realize even though the centurion and the leper seem very, very different, they actually had a great deal in common. The centurion went to Jesus for help, and like the leper, he also assumed Jesus could do amazing things. And when Jesus suggested he go with the centurion to help the servant, the centurion suggested another plan. Here's Matthew 8, verse 7. So the centurion needs his help. Jesus says, well, let's go, and I'll go heal the servant. And the centurion says, no. Essentially, he says this. This is Matthew 8, verse 7. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. Normally, the average day for this centurion, he would be looking down on other people. He was in charge, but not on this day. On this particular day, he was looking up to someone for help. The centurion wasn't feeling his usual impressive self. In fact, he was feeling a little leprous, if you think about it. The centurion thought of Jesus so far above him that he felt it wouldn't be appropriate for Jesus to come to his house. It wasn't just for efficiency's sake. He said, I'm not worthy for you to come over to my house. In the centurion's mind, it would be almost an insult to this teacher. And he suggested they maintain a respectable distance. But even as the centurion focused on this difference, he also pointed out that he was kind of like Jesus. It's interesting and worth pointing out. He's kind of saying, we're not at all alike. So you can't come to my house. I really would feel uncomfortable you doing that. But then he says, but we're kind of alike. Matthew 8, verse 9. For I also am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go. And he goes. And to another, come. And he comes. And to my slave, the one that's sick, do this. And he does it. So the centurion pointed out, he says, we both have authority. I get it. We're a lot alike. The centurion had control of certain things. Jesus had control over certain things. The centurion was in control of soldiers. The big difference was that Jesus was apparently in control of the universe. As far as the centurion was concerned, it was time for Jesus to pull rank. Jesus was shocked. Notice that in the details here. He was surprised. Here was a man who had every reason to approach Jesus with at least a certain amount of arrogance, but instead he approached with humility and a lot of faith in what Jesus could do. Matthew 8, verse 10. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. So Jesus goes along with the centurion's analogy in verse 13. And Jesus said to the centurion, go. You catch what earlier the centurion says, I tell people to go, and they go. And now Jesus is saying, okay, go. He says, go, it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. And notice, referring back to the leper, Jesus doesn't even see the person he heals, let alone touch him. Jesus said, go, and the centurion went, and Jesus did what the centurion asked. He cured the servant. I would like to suggest this morning that we're like the centurion. Our current circumstances put us on a very similar level to him. We're in control. We're blessed with at least a certain amount of health. At the very least, we have access to medicine that many, many other countries would long to have access to, even for a brief time. At the very least, we're doing better than the leper was. And we're surrounded by things that put us in control. And it's easy to believe that everything's under our control. We push buttons and the garage door opens, the TV obeys us, the microwave and the washer obey us. And if things are going relatively well, our bank account bows before us. Most of us are in a relatively high position, and we take it for granted. I really believe that when you're surrounded by so many blessed people, it's hard to see how blessed you are, because it's just the standard. We don't even think twice about running water. You'll forget by the time we leave this morning. You'll forget about the blessing of having running water, or the fact that you will have 3 meals if you want them. They're just there. They've always been there. You probably know this, that outreach programs find it notoriously difficult to reach the lost in wealthier nations or wealthier neighborhoods. And of course, there are certainly those among the rich who are searching, and they shouldn't be overlooked, but the odds favor the run-down homes, the streets, and the bad parts of the world, the leprous parts of the world. And that's where you're more likely to find people interested in the truth. We live on the centurion side of life. It's hard to get our attention. A lot of the other centurions, I'm sure, weren't like this one. We're in control of 100 things that instantly obey. We're more in control of 1,000 things that obey what we want. We gesture and we speak, and our surroundings respond, and it's easy to be fooled into thinking we're in charge. That's why it's such a shock when something comes along to pop that bubble. Everyone will get a turn at being the leper, I guess, and some might spend their whole life dealing with tough times, but regardless, some can still find peace with Jesus, just like the leper did. But the great majority of us will spend our lives as centurions. We will command and control, and our world will obey. But this puts us in a very dangerous position. This is what I'd like to suggest this morning. It's vital for you to remember that you are not in control at all. It takes some wisdom to keep seeing that you need Jesus. You're not going to get on top of this, not on your own. It takes the wisdom of the centurion, the wisdom to see that inside we are all lepers. See, Jesus was approached by 2 lepers. One was just more obvious than the other. Romans 3:23 tells us, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We are in desperate need even more so because we don't realize we're in desperate need. We're lepers on the inside. Fortunately, the centurion saw it. He got it. There's no record of how the leper convinced himself to approach Jesus to commit the equivalent of social suicide. He must have experienced rejection before, many times before. Maybe he'd been standing at a distance. Maybe he was there during the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know. I mean, he was there after. Maybe he was in the vicinity. Maybe he heard some of the things that Jesus said. Maybe the centurion was there that day. I don't know. Maybe it was secondhand that they heard some of the things that he said. Maybe the 2 of them believed the first words that were spoken on the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They both knew they were poor in spirit, in a humble position, needing help. It's important for all of us to remember that is the place where we all are. And if you convince yourself that you're not, you're dealing with an internal leprosy, and it's scary when you don't even realize that you have it. Healing leprosy was just to get their attention, the physical kind. Jesus came to heal a much more serious disease called sin. And all of us have it. One of the worst conditions to be in is to be sick and not know you're sick. All of us were lepers, so to speak, and didn't even really know it. If you're not a Christian, it's pretty important to be straightforward, and we want to encourage you to go to him to let him cure you. That option is available. Through baptism, you can be cleaned and cured of this disease. If you're a Christian, remember that you will always need Jesus. Make sure you rely on him. And it will first require you to acknowledge something pretty difficult. You're not in control. And you make decisions every day, but whether or not you're on top of sin or not, you're going to need Jesus' help. Self-control is definitely required, but you'll need the strength of God to accomplish this. Ultimately, you don't control much at all, at least nothing important. But there is one thing you can control. You can control whether or not you'll go to Jesus every day. Not necessarily just right now, which is available to everybody, but to go to Jesus every day for forgiveness and to be cured again. Whatever your need is, I hope you'll do what these 2 lepers did. Do whatever it takes to get to Jesus and let him handle everything. Let's stand together and encourage each other with this song.
Greeting Christ, your broken life, so marred by sin, He will create anew, make whole again. Your empty, wasted years He will restore, and your iniquity